Hello and welcome to Modern HTML and CSS from the beginning. In this video, I just want to talk a little bit about what you can expect from this course. So this is going to be a comprehensive course on HTML and CSS, and we're going to start from the absolute beginning, starting with HTML5 markup. We'll go through all the basics of CSS to the latest features like Flexbox, CSS Grid, animation, variables, responsive design, and much more. Not only that, you'll also learn Sass in this course, which is a CSS precompiler that extends the syntax of CSS to include things like nesting, inheritance, functions, and more. This course is composed of both learning sections where we'll basically be working in a sandbox to look at certain features, and then we have about a half dozen projects ranging in size, and then some mini projects on top of that. So who is this course actually for? The short answer is everyone. Whether you're an absolute beginner looking to learn how to build websites, how websites work, or a seasoned developer that wants to get better at CSS, Sass, and UI creation in general without having to rely on frameworks like Bootstrap. So sections 1 through 4 are geared more towards beginners as we go over the basics of HTML and CSS. So if you're comfortable with things like HTML5 and CSS topics like font styles, basic alignment, margin and padding, things like that, then feel free to skip these sections and start using Flex, CSS Grid, animation, and Sass. So here's a summary of some of the things that we'll be going over in this course. So we'll start with the basics of how websites work and how the internet works in general in terms of IP addresses, how exactly a website that's stored on a server somewhere else gets displayed in your browser. We'll look at setup and tools. We're using a text editor called VS Code, which is definitely the most popular editor in the web development world, and we'll be using tools such as Emmet. We'll install a couple different extensions as well, get a workflow going of just the core basics of tags and attributes. We'll look at all the basic tags. We'll also look at the semantic tags like header, footer, aside, things like that, and show you how to structure a proper HTML5 document. We'll be looking at CSS fundamentals like the box model, font styles, things like that. Responsive design, so media queries, making everything look good on mobile devices, including smartphones and tablets. Every single project we create is going to be responsive. Okay, we'll be looking at Flexbox, CSS Grid, which are ways to align columns and rows. We'll be looking at animation with transitions and keyframes, CSS variables, transforms, pseudo selectors. We'll be building things like sticky menus, overlays. We'll be styling forms and landing pages. We'll even look at website deployment, so making your website live on the internet using a shared host. We'll also be looking at a platform called Netlify. And then finally, we'll look at Sass, which is a CSS precompiler to allow us to basically extend the functionality of CSS. And we'll create a portfolio project with that. All right, so as I said, this is going to be a mix of learning sections and projects. The learning lectures will include specific topics such as the box model, media queries, and many other things. And then we'll also have 6 good-sized projects along with some other mini projects. So the first website project we'll be building is this hotel website, which is before we even get into Flexbox and the grid and anything like that. We'll be using just basic CSS here, including floats, because I think it's important to learn the basics, even though for the most part you're going to be using Flex or the grid. Next project is this Edge Ledger website, which is a single page site for a financial company. It includes Flexbox, image overlay, sticky menu, things like that. We will be implementing a little bit of JavaScript for smooth scroll. We'll be doing this in a couple projects. However, JavaScript is not the focus of this course. I just want to make that clear. We will be using a little bit of it, but we're not going to really get into JavaScript. This course is more about UI and HTML, CSS, and Sass. So the next project is a news grid site where we use CSS Grid. We use grid template columns, and I show you how to span rows and things like that. Next, we'll build a landing page that uses a hamburger menu. So you guys have probably seen up a menu. We'll have a big overlay that has the menu items. We'll also animate the hamburger menu itself. Then we have a CSS timeline project where we have different items on the timeline. We're going to add a little bit of JavaScript here to bring the items in from the side as we scroll down. And then the last project is a SaaS project where we create a 4-page portfolio site with a home, about, a work page with some pretty in-depth CSS animations, transitions, and then a contact page. And we're going to deploy this to a platform called Netlify and make the contact page actually work with spam filtering. All right, so that's it. Hopefully you enjoy the course and learn a lot from it. So let's jump in and get started. All right, so before we get started, I feel like it's important that you know at least the basic idea of how the process of getting and loading a web page in your browser works. So for some of you, this may be very simple. You may already know this stuff. For some of you, this may be very confusing and daunting. If it is confusing, just know that you'll understand this process more as time goes on, and you don't need to know it to start building websites. I think a good metaphor for this is that you don't need to know how an engine works to be able to learn how to drive a car. And the stuff that I'm going to talk about here in this section, it all happens under the hood. So if you're a beginner and you're just stepping into this world, don't worry if you don't understand this stuff. I just think it's important to mention before we start. All right, so we all use the internet every day, but most people don't know how it actually works. And they just know they go to, Facebook.com or whatever, and it loads their profile, their social media. So I'm going to try to explain what actually goes on under the hood in very simple terms. Basically, the internet is a global network of computers and devices, and these computers have what's called an IP address to uniquely identify them, just like an actual address for your home. And these IP addresses, they're assigned to you by your internet service providers. And they're usually in the form of 4 numbers with dots in between, just like this here. Now, this is a version 4 IP address. There's also version 6 IP addresses that are much longer. And these were created for when we run out of version 4 IP addresses. And you can actually go to Google and just search "what's my IP," and you'll find different sites that will actually trace it and show it to you if you want to know what your current IP address is. Now, even if you have multiple devices in your home, like let's say you have 2 computers, a tablet, a mobile device, each of these devices, they all have what's called a private IP address that is only local to your network, your home network. Your router, however, has a public IP address, and that's the IP address that the internet actually sees. All the private ones for each device, that's only within your home network or your office network, whatever it may be. All right, now the way that computers talk to each other is over something called the TCP/IP protocol. And a protocol is basically just a way for computers to communicate, almost like a language, so they can speak to each other. Don't worry too much about this. If you're getting into computer networking and stuff like that, it's very important to understand the different network layers and so on, how data packets are sent. But that's not important for what we're doing here, or even to become a web developer. Now, HTTP is a little more important for you to understand. This stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And if you notice, when you type in a website URL like google.com, Facebook, you're usually doing HTTP or HTTPS. HTTPS is for secure connections using an SSL certificate, and we'll talk more about that later. But basically, HTTP is what's called an application layer protocol, and it actually runs over TCP, and it's responsible for handling web traffic, Chrome or Firefox, and a web server that stores a website, and we'll talk more about that in the next slide. So HTTP is one of many types of application layer protocols. You also have, for instance, SMTP, which deals with email. You have FTP and SSH. These deal with transferring files over the internet. HTTP, however, is going to be the one you deal with the most in web development. So websites and web pages are basically just files that are stored on computers that server. And an example of a web server would be Apache or Nginx. Don't worry if you've never heard of these before. Technically, you could run a web server from your home on a computer, But most ISPs prohibit doing that, and you probably wouldn't want to do that anyways, because if for some reason the computer shuts off or something happens, your website goes down. So what you usually do is you can machine at your home or office, and then you would upload it to a hosting company, okay, or to a server that a hosting company owns. And there's all different types of hosting accounts. You can actually get a dedicated server, which is an actual computer for your use, but those are really expensive. You have shared hosting where you share accounts on one server with other people. This is much cheaper, and I'll go over the different types of hosting in a later section. But that's basically what you're going to do is use a hosting company, and in addition to that, you're going to need a domain name, which can be a .com, .net, .org, and many other TLDs. Now, remember, all computers, including web, to go to Facebook or Google, and you had to remember something like 7522.128.131. So what happens is when you type in, for instance, http://www.facebook.com, there's something called a DNS, or a domain name service, that actually maps that domain to the correct IP address of visiting. And this makes our lives much easier. Otherwise, you'd probably have a notebook with hundreds of numbers for each website that you want to visit. So later on, I'm actually going to show you how to register a domain name and how to upload a website to a web hosting account. All right, so let's take a quick look at a diagram that kind of explains what we've been talking about. So you, the user, down at the bottom, types in, let's say, google.com into a web browser, and this could be Microsoft Edge, Google Chrome, Firefox, Safari, any web browser, domain name such as google.com, and it maps it to the IP address that's needed, as you can see right here. Okay, once it gets that IP address, it then makes what's called an HTTP request to the web server of that IP address. And then that web server will return a response with the HTML file that needs to be loaded, any other files including CSS files, which are used for styling. You have any images that are on the page, those will get sent, and whatever else is needed for google.com to be loaded in your browser. Now, these HTTP requests, they're made when you load a web page as well as when you, for instance, submit a form. Okay, and there's different types of requests, there's different status codes, but that's all stuff you're going to learn later on when you get into scripting and programming. You don't need to know that stuff to create basic static web pages with HTML and CSS. Okay, so this is obviously a very brief summary. There's a lot more that goes into it. It's much more intricate when you get into networking layers and so on. But that, again, that's not stuff that you guys need to know right now. One thing about web development in general is it can be very overwhelming because there's just so many different technologies to learn. But HTML and CSS, they're the building blocks of all websites and web applications. So in the next video, I want to talk more about the roles of HTML and CSS. Alright guys, so web development involves many different technologies, including HTML, CSS, programming languages, frameworks, tools, and much more. But HTML and CSS are what I call the building blocks. This is where you're going to start, whether you want to build just simple 5-page websites or large social networks and online stores. So I want to talk about the different roles of HTML and CSS, how they play into web development. So HTML is actually short for Hypertext Markup Language, and that's exactly what it is. It's a markup language. Many people that are brand new to web development think it's actually a programming language, but it's not. A programming language is where you write code that can do things based on logic. So you can check to see if something is true or false, and then do some type of action based on that condition. You can also do things like math. You can create reusable functions, and the list goes on. You can't do any of that with HTML. HTML is purely visual, and it's used to construct documents that are viewable inside of a web browser. It doesn't have any kind of behavior associated with it other than displaying content. And when I say content, I mean text, links, images, things like that. Now, this isn't to minimize HTML. In fact, there is no internet as far as the web browser goes without HTML. It's extremely important and relevant, and it always will be. Every single site that you visit displays its markup using HTML, and sometimes it's handwritten, sometimes it's actually generated by another programming language, but when you view the compiled source of a website, you're always going to see HTML markup. Okay, now HTML by itself is used to display content, but it has little to no styling. So HTML on its own is very, very ugly. And this is where CSS comes in. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's what's called a styling language or a style sheet language. Like HTML, it's not an actual programming language. It's purely visual, only instead of being used to display content, it's used to style the content and style the layout. Now, CSS is getting more powerful itself. You can now have things like variables. You can do some calculations and so on. It can also be extended with something called SAS or LESS, which are CSS precompilers. We'll talk a little bit more about SAS later and talk about some of the things you can do with it, but we're gonna do that much later. So basically these two go hand in hand. HTML handles the content display, CSS handles styling it with colors, alignment, fonts, and everything else to do with the styling. Now, as I said, web development includes a huge range of technologies to the point where sometimes it's very overwhelming. But these two are the building blocks because no matter how complicated the web application, it still uses HTML and CSS to display the visual appearance. Let's take a web app like Facebook or Amazon. These are huge web applications that do things like have user accounts. You can sign up, register. You can create posts on Facebook. Amazon does credit card processing. She has a shopping cart. You can't have that functionality with just HTML and CSS. You need some kind of back-end programming language, and there's a lot to choose from. And you also need a database for storage of user accounts and posts and stuff like that. Now, this is stuff you're going to learn in another course, but without HTML and CSS, Facebook and Amazon cease to exist because HTML and CSS are responsible for displaying the content to you in a browser, whether it's on a computer, mobile device, or tablet, whatever it may be. So these two technologies are always the first ones that you're going to learn before moving to more advanced web programming to build shopping carts and stuff like that. So you can kind of think of HTML and CSS as the human body, and think of programming with other languages as the human brain. They both need each other. Now, JavaScript is sort of in its own league because it is a programming language, but it can run on both the front end, which is within the browser, as well as on the back end server. Okay, so JavaScript can be used in the front end for things like form validation, click events, stuff like that. So JavaScript is probably the next thing you want to learn after HTML and CSS. All right, so we've established basically the purpose of HTML and CSS. It's to display web pages and style web pages. So what can we do with just HTML and CSS, not knowing any other programming language? So after this course, you'll be able to build any kind of static website. And by static, I mean still. So something where you're not creating user accounts, you're not creating posts, things like that. And a good example of a static website is, let's say, a portfolio to display some of your projects, a small business website, maybe a plumber wants a website where they can display their company info, their contact info, stuff like that. Plumber, construction, flower shop, anything like that. Also informational and brochure websites. Okay, you can build some really, really beautiful stuff with just HTML and CSS. You just can't have that special kind of functionality like a shopping cart or something like that. You're going to need to learn more to do that stuff. You can also build the visual part of anything. So even an online store or a huge social network like Facebook, you could build basically the shell of it. You'll just have to have a programmer add the life to it where you can actually click post and have it post, or upload an image or something like that. Okay, so you can do this stuff with just HTML and CSS, and I'm going to show you all of this throughout the course. All right, so that's it, guys. In the next video, we're going to start to set up our environment. We're going to need something called a text editor so that we can actually write our HTML and CSS. We're going to use something called VS Code, and we're going to install some extensions to allow it to do some extra things for us. And of course, you need a web browser. We're going to talk about all this in the next video. Alright guys, so we're almost ready to start learning how to learn HTML, CSS, build websites, but before we do that we need a couple things. What's good about learning HTML and CSS is if you're learning a more complex language like let's say PHP or Python or something like that, usually you'll need to install a web server locally so that you can develop on your local machine, and that takes a lot more work. Some languages even need to be compiled and you need something called an IDE. But with HTML CSS, we can simply click on an HTML file and run it in a browser. We can also edit it with a text editor. So those are the two things we need, is a browser and a text editor. Now, it doesn't matter what operating system you're on. If you're using Windows, Mac, Linux, you can see I'm on a Mac, but everything we do in this course, it doesn't matter what you're on. And if there is something little that's specific to Windows, I will mention it for you guys that are using Windows. Now, your system comes with a browser and a text editor. So for Windows you have, for instance, Edge and Notepad. For Mac you have Safari and TextEdit, but these are not good for web development, especially the text editors. For a browser, I would definitely recommend Google Chrome. It's the most popular in the web development community. It's very fast. It's fast to adapt new features in CSS, JavaScript, and so on. It also has really great development tools. Second to Chrome, I would say Firefox. As far as a text editor, you don't want to use Notepad or anything like that because there's no features, there's no syntax highlighting, anything like that. There's a lot of choices, but what I would recommend and what I'm going to use is Visual Studio Code. And I use this for everything. I don't just use it for HTML, CSS. I also use it for PHP, JavaScript, Python, any language that I work with, because it's just very fast, it's intuitive, has a lot of features, it has great extensions, and it's just all around, it's just a great editor. So that's what we'll be using. I don't have it installed, so I'm going to go ahead and download it, and it's available for Windows, Mac, or Linux. Doesn't matter what system you're on. So on a Mac, it's just going to give me the zip file. I'll go ahead and open it up or unpackage it, and you can see I have my icon here, and I'm just going to bring it to my applications folder. Okay, so once it's in there, I can open it up. I'm actually going to drag it down to my bar, which you guys can't see, just so I can easily access it, and then I'll go ahead and open it. So when you first open up VS Code, you'll see a welcome page. It'll give you some options like open up a file, open a folder. It'll show your recent projects, and the only reason I have recent projects is because I already had VS Code installed. I just uninstalled it for this course. If also over here, if you want to change your theme, so if I click color theme, it'll open up this, which is the command palette. And for instance, we could change it to a light theme, and you can kind of experiment with these a little bit. I'm just going to keep the regular dark theme like that. So let's close this welcome page up and head over to the sidebar. So this first icon here is your file explorer. So when you have a website or a web application, it's going to be in a folder, and you're going to want to open that folder so that you can see the files and access them easily. So I actually have a folder that is on my desktop that I'm going to open, called Split Landing Page, which is just a very simple website with some JavaScript and HTML, CSS. So I'm going to open that, and you'll see that I have the files over here. So we have one HTML file, we have a CSS file for styling, and then we have a JavaScript file. And when I just click them once, notice that they just open and they just stay in this one tab, and then it kind of closes when I click on the next one. If I double click, it'll stay. So if I go click on the next file, notice that the HTML, index.html stayed there. Okay, if I double click this one, it'll stay there, and then I can just close them up. And we'll be working in the File Explorer quite a bit. So the next thing I want to show you is the settings. Now this text right here is way too small, especially for doing a course. You guys probably can barely read this. So to get to the settings, you can go to this little gear, and you can go to settings, or you can do control comma on a Windows machine, or command comma on a Mac, and that'll also bring you to the settings. As we go along here, I'm going to be teaching you guys some of the keyboard shortcuts, because your workflow really speeds up when you learn shortcuts. And when we write our code, our HTML, CSS, I'm going to teach you some shortcuts to navigate around really easily as well. So what I want to change is the font size, which is actually right here, editor font size. But if I couldn't find this, I could just search for it up here. So I could say font size, and you can see now it's at the top here. It's 14 pixels by default, so I want to change it to 26, and that should take effect right away. The only other setting I want to change is my tab space. So if I type in tab spaces, the default is 4, and what this means is the number of spaces that it indents when you hit tab. Okay, because in HTML and in most languages you're gonna indent to organize your code, but 4 is a little too much for me. I like to keep it at 2, so I'm going to change that to 2, and that should save right away. So let's close up the settings, and now if I go back to, let's say, index.html, notice the font is much bigger. Okay, and a tab now is 2 spaces as opposed to 4. So the last thing I want to do is just go over these other icons. This one is just to search. So if you want to search within the page, you can also replace. This is for version control with Git. We're not going to get into that right now. This is a debugger for programming languages like Python, JavaScript, and so on. Also something we're not going to get into. But this one right here, the last one, is your extensions. Okay, so you can extend the functionality of VS Code with a whole bunch of extensions, and we don't have any installed right now, but it does show some of the popular ones, shows us some of the recommendations. If you want to search, you can search, like let's say we're using if we want to search for PHP extensions, like this one right here, IntelliSense. And if we click on that, it'll show us a bunch of documentation and examples. Basically, this gives you some PHP drop downs, as you can see right here. If we wanted to install this, we could just click the green install button and it would simply get installed. And if I make this a little bigger, you can see the number of downloads. You can see this one has 5.7 million downloads and a rating of 3.5. Okay, so you see the number of downloads as well as the ratings. And I do have a couple extensions that I want to install later, but I don't want to get into that right now. All right, so now that you have VS Code set up, in the next section, we're going to jump in and we're going to start to learn HTML. All right, welcome to HTML Basics. So in this section, we're going to start learning HTML5 from absolute scratch. And I just want to stress that this section is geared towards absolute beginners. I know that there's a few different types of people taking this course. Those of you that are just getting into this, that need to learn HTML, this is geared towards you guys. And then there's those of you that are comfortable with HTML that took this course to learn more about creating better looking websites and user interfaces, see it more geared towards CSS. Just be aware that this particular section is very basic and it might be a lot of stuff that you already know. So feel free to skip it if you need to. So here's what we'll be covering in this section. We'll talk a little bit about what HTML is. We'll look at the syntax of HTML tags and attributes, how to structure a page, including the doc type, meta tags. We're going to set up VS Code with an extension called Live Server so that we can open our HTML pages easily in a little local development server. We're going to talk about keyboard shortcuts in VS Code, also Emmet. Forms and input, links and images, tables and lists. We're going to look at the differences between block level elements and inline elements. We'll look at divs, spans, compare IDs and classes, HTML entities, and we'll also look at the HTML5 semantic tags. So the way this is going to work is for every section we'll be creating a new file in a folder called HTML Sandbox, and I want you guys to have this as a reference to go back to if needed. And we're going to target specific tags and concepts in each file. Okay, so we'll have like a forms and input file. We'll have a file for tables and lists and paragraphs and headings, things like that. So we're going to do it in this section and in the next CSS section, and then after that we'll build a real website using all the knowledge that we learned from both. All right, so I'm going to include both the starting files and the finished sandbox in this lecture for you to download. So you can either use that or you can create the files as we move along like I'm doing. And then I also want to mention that HTML itself without CSS is very, very ugly. So everything in this section is going to look like crap in the browser because there's no styling. When we get to the CSS section, we'll start learning how to align things, how to add backgrounds, colors, borders, stuff like that. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in. Alright guys, so we're going to jump right in and start to learn HTML. We're going to learn all the important HTML5 tags, attributes. We'll learn how to insert images into pages, links, forms, stuff like that. And I realize that a lot of you guys probably already know some of this stuff, so feel free to skip around, skip some videos. If you want to skip this whole section altogether, that's fine. Later on, after section 3, we'll be getting into like CSS grid and flexbox and animations and more difficult stuff. But again, I want this course to be very friendly for absolute beginners that have never even touched HTML before. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a new folder for our HTML files. So we'll just go ahead and right click and say new folder, and I'm going to rename this to HTML Sandbox. And the idea here is for every section, or every video I should say, we're going to be touching on a different topic. So for instance, we'll look at like links and images in a video, we'll look at forms and input, and I want to have a separate file for each video and create a sandbox that you can use as a reference if you need to go back to it later on to see how a tag is structured or what attributes it takes, things like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and open this up in VS Code, in Visual Studio Code. And there's a few ways to do that. If you're on Windows, you should be able to right click and say open with code. You can do it that way. If you're on a Mac, you can drag it down to your VS Code icon in your bar down below, or you can just open up VS Code and just click open folder and then search for it. So mine's on my desktop. There it is, HTML Sandbox, and I'll go ahead and open. Alright, so we can close this up, and now on the side you can see the HTML Sandbox folder is open. So let's go ahead and create our first HTML file. And I'm basically going to create a file called index.html. Whoops, not comma, but .html. Now there's something really important for Windows users. If you are seeing a .txt here after the .html, then you have to actually change something in your folder settings. Alright, so I have a screenshot here. If you're on Windows and you're seeing a .txt, you should check this anyways to make sure that this box is unchecked. What you want to do is go to your View tab in your file manager and go to Options right here, and then click Change Folder and Search Options. You'll get a box like this that pops up, and you want to click the View tab and make sure that this is unchecked, this Hide Extensions for Known File Types. Okay, you want it to show the file extension. So just make sure that that's unchecked if you're on Windows. Alright, so I just wanted to mention that so you don't run into problems. So now we have an HTML file. So what do we do with this? We need to put in what's called an HTML tag. Okay, so HTML files are full of HTML tags which surround content. So let's take a look at how HTML tags are actually formatted. So elements are surrounded in angle brackets. So basically the less than and greater than signs. So the element here, for example, is an H1, and different elements do different things. This is a heading tag. There's actually H1 through H6, and I'm going to go over that in another video. But basically this will make this text much bigger. Okay, this here is a paragraph tag, which is just for paragraphs, just regular sized text. And notice that there's an opening tag and there's a closing tag, or a start and an end tag. And the end tag has a /. Okay, so that's how you identify the ending tag. Now there are some self-closing tags for stuff that doesn't have content inside of it, like the H1 and the paragraph, they have content inside. The BR tag is actually just a line break, so it just kind of skips a line. So there's no need to put any content inside of it, so it's a self-closing tag. It doesn't need an ending tag. Now, notice that this one has a / and this one doesn't. This is actually a remnant of XHTML, which is a derivative of HTML, and it's not used that much anymore. HTML5 is definitely the standard. That's what you want to learn. In HTML5 you could use either of these, so you can use the XHTML version with the line or the /, but you don't need to. This would be just fine. Okay, so this is how tags are structured. So what I'm going to do now is just put in a couple tags, and I want to show you how to open an HTML file in the browser. So remember, tags have an opening angle bracket, and we'll do an H1, which is a heading. We'll close that H1. And with VS Code, every text editor is different. With VS Code, it's going to end the tag for you. Okay, so notice that the ending tag was put in automatically, which is very helpful. And VS Code actually has a tool that comes pre-installed called Emmet, which you can use to type really fast HTML. And I'm going to show you some tips and tricks with Emmet as we move along. So let's put something in here. We'll just say, welcome to my website. And then we're going to go on the next line, and we're going to put a paragraph tag. Now remember, we have Emmet installed, and with Emmet we can just do P, because we want a paragraph tag, which is a P, and then we can hit enter or tab. Okay, you can do enter or tab, and it'll actually complete it for us. Okay, so it makes it very easy. If we want, an H2 tag, we can do H2 enter. If we want, so let's say, an image tag, we can do IMG enter, and that will actually give us the attributes that we need. I'm going to go over all this stuff later, so don't worry about it. But just to show you that Emmet is very helpful, and it allows you to write HTML very fast. Okay, so in the paragraph, let's just say this is my very first website. Okay, so we just have a heading tag and a paragraph. Let's go ahead and save this. You can either go to File, Save, or you can just do Control-S or Command-S on a Mac, and that will save the file. Okay, so now let's go ahead and minimize this, and let's go into our HTML sandbox folder, and you can see we have our index.html file. Now, you might have a different icon. It's probably going to be whatever your default browser is. It could be Chrome, Edge if you're on Windows. So you just want to open this with a browser. So I'm actually going to right-click and just say Open with Google Chrome, which is my default browser. And there it is. So you can see that the H1 is a large heading, and then the paragraph is just normal size text. But this is in fact an HTML file. You can see in the URL bar here, it gives us the full path. Okay, yours will probably be different, but mine is in my desktop in HTML Sandbox and then index.html. Now, of course, when you upload this to a web host, it'll be your domain name. So let's say you registered mywebsite.com, which of course is already taken, but we'll use that as an example. So this would be replaced, this file, this stuff here would all be replaced with whatever your domain is. Now, there's a reason that I called it index.html, and this name here is significant because when you call it index.html, this is your home page. If we were to upload this to a host with, let's say, mywebsite.com as the domain, if we go to mywebsite.com, it's going to load the index page. Okay, so it's very important to understand that. Whatever you want your home page, you want to call that index. And then any other page you can call whatever you want. Like let's say you had an about page that listed your company info or something like that. You could create an about.html page, upload it, and then you would go to mywebsite.com/about.html. Okay, and that would load that. But index is significant because that's always going to be your home page. All right, so now that we have created an HTML file and opened it with Chrome, in the next video I'm going to show you how to correctly structure an HTML document, because this isn't correct. There's some other things that we need to add in order for it to be a valid HTML document. All right, so we'll get into that next. All right, guys, so in the last video, we created an index.html file. We opened it inside of a browser so we could see how it renders. And this is not the standard of how to create a document. There's some other things that you need to add. Even if we only wanted to display this in the browser, there's some other tags that we need to add for it to be a valid HTML5 document. Now, before we do anything, I'm going to rename this file. So instead of index, I'm going to rename it to 01_basic_layout.html, because like I said, I want this to be a sandbox that you can go back to and you can check certain things, and I want each file to be named after what what we're doing inside of it. Okay, so we're going to just number them so they're in order. If you don't want to number them, you don't have to. You could call it just basic layout or basic or whatever, but I want to be very specific, and I want you guys to have this for future reference. All right, so basic layout of an HTML page. Let's actually just get rid of this for now. So the first thing that you're going to want on every HTML page is the doc type. Okay, so I'm just going to type this out. It's going to be an angle bracket, exclamation, doc type, usually all capitals, and then HTML, and then closing angle bracket. So this is a doc type, and what this does is it tells the browser what type of document it is, because a browser can read HTML5, it can read XHTML, it can read HTML 4.0.1. So there's a lot of different variations of HTML, but HTML5 is definitely the standard, and that's what you're going to want to use. It's also much easier than the others, and it's less strict when it comes to tag syntax. So I just want to quickly show you from the w3schools.com site, which is a great site for reference. This is a page all on doc types. And if we go down here, you'll see that the doc type declaration must be the very first thing in your HTML document before the HTML tag, which I'll go over in a second. And down here it gives us the different types. So for HTML5, it's what we just did. But then you'll see that HTML 4.0.1 actually has a much longer doc type because there's different variations. There's strict, transitional, frame set, and this has to do with what's allowed and what's not. So it's gotten much easier over the years with HTML5. So we don't have to worry about these doc types, but I just wanted to show you that they're very different. XHTML has its own doc type, has transitional, frame set, 1.0, 1.1, but this is the only one that we have to worry about. All right, so I just wanted to kind of show you that. So we're declaring this document as HTML5. The next thing we want is an HTML tag. Okay, so I'll do HTML and then hit enter or tab, and it'll finish it for me. And we just want to hit enter so that the bottom tag is down below. And now inside the HTML tag, we have a head tag, and then under the head, we have a body tag. Now notice that there's an indent here, and VS Code will do this automatically.